the right time frame of change process. And many research studies, for example, in our GEMS program itself, just to go back to the example, we did 2 years of program in the schools, and we realized that in 2 years you don't change things. And that was something that you don't need. It's not a that it won't be changed. So we went back to the donors and said that we should set up the panel, or the longitudinal studies in the same communities, and we are tracking them over past, at every interval of every 1 year, we track the group of children to see if what is retained, what is not retained, and why they are retained, and what changes are happening, and how can we explain those changes. Look at those triggers and things like that, of changes. So that again is part of, it has to be part of the research paradigm of looking at that. So static, one-time, one-off studies are not really fit for studying the social change, but the name suggests it is a change that we are looking at. So we just can't justify one-time, one-off, study and say, okay, we have done cross-sectional analysis by using all multivariate analysis and say that we have seen that kind of change. That's misleading. In fact, that's not the right approach. So thank you very much for pointing out those issues, because they are really the reminders for all of us too.
Very, very quick answers. A great question on internal factors, focusing on drought, etc. And that's what when I say that our knowledge of I'm just focused on interventions, but we don't really understand, and our program theories are incomplete. These are great opportunities to learn. There are some districts in Maharashtra who are affected by drought, others who are not. That provides you a test bed of understanding context, mechanism, outcome, configuration. Great question on timelines. In the first 3 months of an evaluation, I ask people on the ground, people who are actually the Mahadevs, I'm going to come to Mahadev in a minute from now, how long do you think this is going to take to impact you? I'm going to ask Abhijit, how long do you think I asked the funders, and I've done this repeatedly. Funders and academics have a far shorter time frame of saying, ye 3 saal mein ho jayega. When you go talk to people on the ground, they say, hey, we've been doing this before you were born, so relax. Okay, and so I think that sense of time is a little different. So it's a good question. The question on, I think Sophie's question, my answers will surprise you. I work in an academic institution. I don't think it's a question of inaccessible language. I think you're being too polite. It's a question of values. I'm not convinced that, and this is, I'm being too generalizable, but I think as more and more I'm seeing academic-based research, our values are somewhat different, and I'm being a little crass in my general. But I would be tough on whether you're doing participatory research or any kind of research. I would want, just as we have an ethics agreement at the individual level, that you shall not, at the community level, we should have a few exit strategies. If you violate A, B, C, and D being don't speak in an accessible language, see ya. So that sort of contract needs to be drawn up in a much more fiercer way. I think people on the ground are far more closer to the complex process than so. I think the language of inaccessible stuff, that's silly stuff. I think the gentleman from South Africa, even though I was the one who complained that a large number of interventions don't work, I'm also the one who actually believes things are improving quite tremendously. I would want you to see TED.com or TED.org, Hans Rosling presentation recently from 6 months ago, and he gives a quiz. Most people flunk the quiz because we are caught up in a paradigm where things are getting worse. So I challenge you to look at that. But I think your question is a great one, because I think we have not, what NASA does very well is they don't expect the first 20 rockets to fly. There's a certain learning from failure in the most central sense. We expect our first rocket to blah blah blah. So I think that's a little silly. But for me, the question that the gentleman from Vietnam asked, the spiritual element, is what connects me to Mahadev. Where for me, Laos. I'm sorry. I apologize. Laos. Sorry, my fault. I didn't hear it, bro. But still, the more important part is the spiritual element. And for me, just having returned from Maharashtra and meeting Mahadev, the central question for me is the question of mechanism. What did the intervention do? Or it may not be anything to do with intervention too, by the way, that got Mahadev to change, or I don't know, I've just met him a few days, just watched him on TV. But I'm just using him as a metaphor. And was it something spiritual? Was it informational, etc.? And there is where I think even at the narrowest intervention level, there's an incredible mystery that I invite you to explore. That's not qualitative or quantitative, but whether it's spiritual, whether it's other types of mechanisms. Once you delve into mechanism, I think it's quite remarkable. No, sir.
Not necessarily. You want to have some thoughts?
Go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to respond to this question of activism and research, or researcher activists, and the place of the donors, etc. Since I'm in an academic institution, teach, etc., etc., I'm also part of an activist group. And what I have very poignantly realized, that first of all researchers are not activists, and all activists are not researchers. We had this heated debate in my activist group when we were pursuing some cases of violence against women, and they said, violence against women has increased. I said, how do you know it's increased? He said, of course it has increased. I said, but how do you know? And so they didn't know. They said, well, it's being reported in the newspaper. I said, maybe more. We don't have a base. But that's how the activists work. I mean, they get moved by, I mean, it's very much the human rights. You take an incident, you run with it, and it has its impact, but we are not interested as activists in noting down impact, and media comes and we tell them. But as researcher, because that big argument led me to write a concept note. I said, in Pakistan, we don't have a database on violence against women in Pakistan. And I said, if we had the database, all we would have done was quickly see what the data is saying. We know a lot of money has been poured in violence against women, but there's no database. Now, these are issues as a researcher I carry. As an activist, I get poo-pooed on that. I say, what are you talking about? So I think that's a reality. Now, what the donor is saying, and that's where the women's movement, the feminists have got a big shock, is the donor is saying, do this study in 18 months. And if it's related to gender, it's related to social change, you can't do it in 18 months. By the time you get your act together, you hardly have 3 months in the field. But you also know there are researchers who will do it. So I think that's problematizing the situation here. And there's no easy answer. What has happened in Pakistan, I'll give that example. There's a lot of work on gender, but gender has been depoliticized. It's been taken as little tricks that people do, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of big money that is flowing in is going to organizations that are being headed by men. So a lot of women's organizations say, hey, what's going on? He said, yeah, what's going on? So we got together to do something about it. But these are really unfortunate realities. And we've got to strategize on that.
Just very quickly, there's so many good questions, and I'm someone who likes questions more than answers. But just in relation to this question about space for social movements within this kind of paradigms of development that we have, and leaving aside the question of how much difference development might actually make in the bigger picture is, leaving that aside. I think that's a really important question and a difficult question, and very deeply rooted in kind of questions of knowledge, power, and when you recall the fact that knowledge is power and that the funding for the knowledge is, even more powered, if you like, you have to remember how power works in terms of, so hegemonic masculinity, for example, the power of co-option. Hegemonic systems of power co-opt progressive agendas into the workings of that power order, for good or bad. And not all power orders are bad. Don't get me wrong. But so there is a challenge in this idea of creating space for movement in research. I think it's an important thing to try to do, but I think we also need to think about claiming space, because invited spaces are not always, they can be treacherous in a sense, because they are created with agendas in mind. And if you're working with progressive movement or social movements in terms of them driving change, I think you need to be a little bit cautious about that power of co-option and bringing it back to politics, understand how power works. Some of the most interesting question for me at the moment is, how do we actually study not just communities but the people in power? What kind of methodologies do we need? What kind of new combinations of qualitative and quantitative methods do we need that we might not have thought about before? And interactive methods. With participation, we've learned a lot around how to work with powerless people. We don't really know how to do this with very powerful people, actually, if we're honest. those are some key questions for me. And beyond that, we, as researchers, we also have power in these processes. And how do we see ourselves and understand ourselves in those research processes? How can we become more reflexive in how we engage? That's a key question for me, and a difficult one. And it finally also one that brings it down to kind of the more personal level. How can we, as powerful people, as men in particular, but as white or as powerful in any other way, how can we make that engagement political as well as personal, understanding that in a kind of embodied sense as well, so making the personal political. And a final word about interventions. So we started talking a lot about interventions, and we do get this duality of interventions and movements and so on. And I was making a lot of notes about what about non-intervention, philosophy of non-intervention as a way towards development, and having a reflective kind of engagement with those who are actually making change happen. So I'll shut up there.
I think we have had a great level of discussion and questions. I think I'll not be doing justice if I summarize, but let me reflect on just one point of this duration of intervention. We as program managers, we look at what has been the intervention. Thank you. How has a similar intervention been designed, or even if it's a new intervention, we look at what probably could be, let's say, 2 years. I think even in the Samajdar Jodidar, we thought that we could have a 2-year intervention, but then what we used was an assessment which showed that the long-term outputs that we are looking at might not be changing in the 2 years, but it was seeming to be a tipping point which compelled us to extend it for 1 more year, and that's when we found several amount of new things that we did not first place consider started to happen. Anyway, I thank you all for this excellent year, and one of the indicators for the success of this event is that I have is there hasn't been hardly 2 people left, and all of you have been here and patiently participating, and I think this is shows that this has been a great panel.